The only B-52 in the world with this radar just crashed. There is no replacement, none. 8 people are dead. 1 aircraft is burning in the California desert, and the United States Air Force just lost a capability that took years to build, exists nowhere else on the planet, and cannot simply be rebuilt overnight. Tail number 6-0-0061 was not a standard B-52. It was the only airborne testbed in existence for a next-generation radar system tied to a $48.6 billion program that determines whether every B-52 in the American fleet can survive in the threat environment of the next 3 decades. It is gone. And here is the part that nobody in the mainstream coverage is stopping to explain. This crash does not just kill 8 Americans on a California flight line, it potentially kills the timeline for modernizing the most iconic strategic bomber in the history of warfare. The question the Air Force cannot answer publicly right now is exactly how long it will take to recover, and the answer to that question matters far beyond the United States. Stay with me, because this story is considerably larger than the wreckage at Edwards. Tail number 6-0-0061 was not a standard B-52. It was the only airborne testbed in existence for a next-generation radar system tied to a $48.6 billion program that determines whether every B-52 in the American fleet can survive in the threat environment of the next 3 decades. It is gone. And here is the part that nobody in the mainstream coverage is stopping to explain. This crash does not just kill 8 Americans on a California flight line. It potentially kills the timeline for modernizing the most iconic strategic bomber in the history of warfare. The question the Air Force cannot answer publicly right now is exactly how long it will take to recover. And the answer to that question matters far beyond the United States. Stay with me, because this story is considerably larger than the wreckage at Edwards. Let us begin with what we know for certain, because in a story like this, the foundation of confirmed fact matters enormously before we start discussing implications and assessments. On the morning of this crash, a B-52H Stratofortress, tail number 6-0-0061, assigned to the 419th Flight Test Squadron at Edwards Air Force Base in California, went down shortly after takeoff. 8 people aboard were killed. The aircraft was destroyed. An Air Force Accident Investigation Board was activated immediately, which is standard protocol for any Class A mishap. The military's designation for incidents involving loss of life or destruction of aircraft valued above $2 million. This aircraft was worth considerably more than $2 million. It was worth, in functional terms, considerably more than its replacement cost in raw aluminum and avionics would suggest because of what it was carrying and what that equipment represented. And that is where this story changes. The AN/APQ-188 is a next-generation synthetic aperture radar system being developed as part of the Commercial Engine Replacement Program and the broader B-52J modernization effort. The B-52J designation refers to the upgraded configuration of the B-52H fleet following the completion of the re-engining and avionics modernization programs currently under contract. The AN/APQ-188 is not a minor upgrade to an existing radar. It is a ground-up replacement for the aging AN/APQ-166 system that current B-52H aircraft carry, and it represents a fundamental shift in how the aircraft senses, tracks, and engages targets in a modern threat environment. But here is the part nobody is talking about. There was exactly 1 aircraft in the entire world that had been modified to carry and test this radar in operational flight conditions. 1. Tail number 6-0-0061, not 2, not a primary and a backup. 1 aircraft, 1 program, 1 irreplaceable testbed. The engineering work required to modify a B-52H airframe to carry the AN/APQ-188 test installation is not a weekend job. It requires structural modifications to accommodate the new radome geometry, avionics bay reconfigurations, cooling system upgrades, electrical bus modifications, and a software integration architecture that took years to develop and certify for flight. All of that is now gone. The real question is what this means for the B-52J program timeline. And the answer requires understanding what a flight test program actually does and why losing the testbed at this specific moment is so damaging. A radar system does not go from laboratory bench testing to fleet-wide installation in a straight line. It goes through a progression of developmental test phases where the system is exercised in actual flight conditions, against actual atmospheric variables, against actual target signatures, and with actual electromagnetic interference environments that cannot be replicated in a ground-based anechoic chamber. Every anomaly detected during flight testing generates a data report. Every data report drives a software update or a hardware tweak. Every tweak has to be retested. This iterative cycle is how you arrive at a system that works reliably across the entire operational envelope of the aircraft, from low-altitude penetration profiles to high-altitude standoff strike configurations, in weather conditions ranging from clear desert air to North Pacific storm systems. If you lose the testbed mid-cycle, you do not just pause the program at the point where you stopped. You potentially lose months of accumulated test data correlation. You disrupt the engineering teams whose workflow is built around an active flying program. You lose the institutional momentum that keeps a complex developmental effort moving forward. And you are forced into a resource competition to either acquire and modify a replacement airframe or restructure the test program around a different approach. And that is where things become far more complicated. The B-52H fleet is not large. The United States currently operates 76 B-52H aircraft across 2 operational bomb wings and the Air Force Reserve. Of those 76, not all are in full operational status at any given time. Aircraft cycle through program depot maintenance, through modification programs, through training rotations and operational deployments. Pulling another airframe out of that pool, ferrying it to a depot facility, modifying it to carry the AN/APQ-188 test installation, and certifying it for flight testing is a process that takes time the program office may not have budgeted for, and money that Congress will need to appropriate above and beyond the existing program baseline. But here is the part that makes this strategically consequential rather than merely operationally inconvenient. The B-52J modernization program exists because the Air Force has made a specific strategic decision. Rather than retiring the B-52H fleet as originally planned and replacing it entirely with the B-21 Raider, the Air Force concluded that a modernized B-52HE, carrying new engines, new communication systems, new radar, and new weapons integration capabilities, could remain a relevant and lethal platform well into the 2050s. This decision was not made casually. It was made after extensive analysis of the threat environment, the production timeline for the B-21, the cost of maintaining an adequate bomber fleet during the transition period, and the risk of capability gaps if the B-52 fleet was retired before sufficient B-21 numbers were available. The B-52J program is the load-bearing pillar of that strategy, and the AN/APQ-188 is the load-bearing pillar of the B-52J program. What happened next matters even more when you consider the geopolitical context in which this crash occurred. The United States is currently managing an extremely complex strategic environment in the Pacific. The People's Liberation Army Air Force and its associated air defense network have been advancing at a pace that has alarmed American defense planners for the better part of a decade. China's integrated air defense system, built around long-range surface-to-air missile systems, advanced fighter aircraft with active electronically scanned array radars, and an increasingly sophisticated sensor fusion and battle management architecture, represents a threat environment that current B-52H radar systems were not optimized to penetrate. The AN/APQ-188 was being developed specifically with this threat environment in mind. The radar's synthetic aperture capabilities, its electronic protection modes, its low probability of intercept design features, all of these were engineering responses to a specific threat picture, and all of them were being validated through the flight test program that just lost its only airborne platform. Now think about what the investigation will focus on, because this is where the story becomes even more layered. The B-52H has a flight control architecture that is unlike any other aircraft currently in the American inventory. It entered service in 1961. Its fundamental control system design predates fly-by-wire technology, predates digital flight control computers, and predates most of the human factors research that shapes how modern aircraft are designed to manage cockpit workload during high-stress flight phases. The B-52H uses a combination of hydromechanical and electrical flight control systems that have been incrementally updated over 6 decades, but remain rooted in design principles from the early jet age. The departure phase, the takeoff roll, and initial climb is statistically the most accident-prone phase of any flight. Engine anomalies that are manageable at cruise altitude can be catastrophic at low altitude with insufficient energy state margin to recover. Structural issues that create no symptoms in level flight at altitude can present violently during the dynamic load environment of takeoff, and avionics failures that are merely inconvenient at cruise can rapidly escalate into loss of control situations when the aircraft is close to the ground with limited options for crew response. The Accident Investigation Board will be looking at all of these possibilities simultaneously. And here is the part that makes the investigation particularly sensitive. Tail 6-0-006. 1 was not flying a standard mission profile. It was conducting developmental flight testing on a next-generation radar system that included software integration elements that are not present on any other B-52H. The question that will be asked, and that will be asked very carefully with enormous institutional sensitivity, is whether any aspect of the AN/APQ-188 test installation, its electrical demands, its software interface with aircraft systems, its physical installation geometry, contributed in any way to the sequence of events that led to the crash. This is not an accusation. This is standard accident investigation methodology. When an experimental aircraft carrying non-standard systems goes down, you examine every interface between the experimental system and the base aircraft. Everyone. You do not assume the experimental system had nothing to do with it. You prove it, rigorously, or you find the mechanism by which it did. That process takes time, and it will shape the decisions made about how the AN/APQ-188 program is restructured going forward. And that is not the most important part. There is a second investigative thread that will run parallel to the physical cause investigation, and it concerns the AI integration question that has been increasingly central to the B-52J program as a whole. The modernization effort for the B-52H has not been limited to hardware. The Air Force has been investing significantly in the software architecture that will govern how the B-52J integrates sensor data, manages weapons employment decisions, and interfaces with the broader joint force network that American doctrine increasingly depends on. This includes elements of machine learning-assisted target recognition, automated electronic warfare response, and data fusion capabilities that represent the leading edge of what the Air Force is trying to accomplish across its entire bomber force. The question being asked in certain circles, not publicly, not officially, but in the conversations that happen between engineers and program managers and operational testers who have been watching this program closely, is what role the software complexity of the test installation played in the operational demands on the crew during the departure phase of the flight. Modern experimental avionics installations routinely require active monitoring and management by flight test engineers seated at operator stations in the aircraft's cabin. Those crew members are managing systems, recording data, responding to anomalies, and in some cases making real-time adjustments to test configurations. If a critical anomaly developed during the departure phase of this specific flight, what did it demand of the crew in the most dangerous seconds of any flight test mission? That question is going to be very difficult to answer without the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, and it is going to drive a much larger conversation about how the Air Force manages the human workload implications of flying increasingly complex experimental configurations on airframes that were designed in an era when the most sophisticated thing a B-52 crew member had to manage was a nuclear weapons release checklist. But here is the part nobody is talking about that connects all of this to the next chapter. The B-21 Raider is real. It is flying. Northrop Grumman has been conducting developmental test flights from Edwards Air Force Base, the same base where 60-0061 just went down, and the program has been progressing, at least by official Air Force accounts, broadly on schedule. The B-21 is the aircraft that is supposed to eventually shoulder the penetrating strike mission that the B-52 cannot perform against advanced integrated air defense systems. But the B-21 is expensive, its production rate is classified, and the number of aircraft that will ultimately be procured remains a subject of significant debate in Congress and in the defense analysis community. The B-52J modernization program exists precisely because the Air Force cannot afford to bet the entirety of its long-range strike capability on B-21 production timelines going exactly as planned. History suggests that major defense acquisition programs rarely go exactly as planned. The B-52J is the hedge. The AN/APQ-188 is the technology that makes the hedge viable. And Tail 60-0061 was the vehicle through which that technology was being proven. Now it is not. And what happened next matters even more when you consider what Congress is going to do with this. The $48.6 billion figure attached to the B-52 modernization program is not a number that passes without scrutiny on Capitol Hill under any circumstances. It is the kind of number that generates hearings, that generates independent cost assessments from the Government Accountability Office, that generates the kind of oversight attention that program offices simultaneously depend on for funding authorization and dread for the delays and requirements changes that can accompany intense congressional scrutiny. The crash of the sole testbed for the program's most critical technology system is the kind of event that puts this program under a microscope in the most unfavorable possible timing. The Air Force will need to brief Congress. It will need to explain what happened, what it means for the program, what the recovery plan is, what the new cost estimate is, and why the program remains viable and worth continued investment. It will need to do all of this while the accident investigation is still ongoing, which means it will be answering questions without yet having definitive answers about cause, contributing factors, or the full scope of what was lost in terms of test data and program knowledge. This is not a comfortable position for any program office to be in, and it is going to test the Air Force's institutional credibility on a program that has already faced skepticism from certain quarters about whether modernizing a 60-year-old airframe is genuinely the right investment compared to accelerating B-21 procurement. The real question is whether this crash becomes the event that fundamentally reorients the strategic debate about American long-range strike capability, and if so, in which direction. There are two directions it could go. The first direction, Congress concludes that the loss of the testbed, the resulting program delays, and the cost of recovery justify a fundamental reassessment of the B-52J investment. The argument in this case would be that the money would be better spent accelerating B-21 production, accepting a potential capability gap in the interim, and retiring the B-52H on an accelerated timeline once sufficient B-21 numbers are available. This argument has adherents in the defense analysis community and on certain committees. It will gain new energy from this crash. The second direction, Congress concludes that the crash, however tragic, demonstrates precisely why the B-52J program cannot be abandoned. The logic in this case would be that the B-21 production timeline is insufficiently certain to justify discarding the hedge that a modernized B-52 fleet provides. The AN/APQ-188 program will be restructured, a replacement test bed will be acquired and modified, additional funding will be appropriated, and the program will continue, at a cost and on a timeline that is now longer and more expensive than what was planned. These are not equally weighted possibilities. The institutional inertia behind a $48.6 billion program that has been authorized and funded through multiple budget cycles is enormous. Programs of this scale do not get canceled because of a single test aircraft loss, however catastrophic. They get restructured, repriced, and rescoped. But the restructuring process has its own costs, its own risks, and its own consequences for the strategic calculus that the program was designed to serve. And here is the part that takes this beyond the borders of the United States. America's allies that operate long-range aviation assets, the United Kingdom, Australia, are deeply embedded in the strategic planning assumptions that govern how American bomber forces are employed in the Pacific and in the European theater. American B-52s regularly exercise with allied air forces, participate in nuclear assurance missions that communicate deterrence posture to potential adversaries, and serve as visible instruments of alliance commitment. When the technological foundation of those assets is disrupted, even temporarily, it creates questions in allied capitals about the reliability and depth of American commitments that go well beyond any single aircraft or any single program. China's defense establishment will have noted this crash within hours. Their analysts will be assessing exactly what was lost, exactly what the program delay implications are, and exactly what this means for the timeline on which the B-52H fleet can be expected to field the capabilities that American Pacific strategy depends on. This is not speculation. This is what defense intelligence establishments do. Every major American military program has Chinese, Russian, and Iranian analysts assigned to track it, assess its status, and report implications back to their respective command authorities. The fact that there was only one test bed, that there is no backup, and that the crash was public enough to be confirmed within hours. These are facts that have already been entered into every relevant foreign intelligence assessment of American strategic aviation capability. What happened next, in terms of how the Air Force chooses to respond publicly and operationally, will itself be read as a signal. A rapid, confident, specific announcement of a recovery plan signals institutional resilience. A prolonged period of silence or vague statements signals uncertainty and internal disagreement. The Air Force knows this. How it manages the public communication dimension of this crisis is itself a strategic decision, not just a public affairs function. But there is one more element of this story that has not yet been fully examined in any of the coverage, and it is the element that I think will ultimately define how this chapter of American airpower history is remembered. The men and women who died aboard Tail 60-0061 were not generic military personnel filling slots on a manifest. Flight test crew members at Edwards Air Force Base are among the most specialized, most experienced, and most irreplaceable human assets in the entire United States Air Force. Test pilots assigned to the 419th Flight Test Squadron complete graduate-level academic programs in flight test engineering before they ever fly a single test sortie at Edwards. The flight test engineers and systems operators who occupy the cabin crew stations on a developmental test aircraft like 60-0061 carry years of program-specific institutional knowledge that cannot be packaged, transferred, or quickly rebuilt after a loss. They know the aircraft, they know the system, they know every anomaly that has been observed in every previous test flight. They carry in their heads the kind of nuanced, contextual understanding of a developmental program that no database can fully capture. The Air Force lost 8 of these people. It will acknowledge their sacrifice with the ceremony and gravity it deserves, and then it will face the harder, quieter question of how it replaces the institutional knowledge they carried, in addition to the aircraft and the equipment. This is the human dimension of the crisis that the program cost figures and the radar specifications cannot capture. A developmental test program is not just hardware and software. It is people who have invested years of their professional lives in understanding a specific aircraft, a specific system, and a specific mission. When those people are gone, the program loses something that money alone cannot buy back quickly. The investigation will take time. The findings will be classified in significant portions. The recovery plan will be developed, reviewed, revised, and eventually briefed to Congress. The program will continue in some form because the strategic need it addresses has not changed and will not change. But it will continue differently than it would have continued before the morning of this crash. The timeline will be longer, the cost will be higher, the risk profile will be reassessed, and the decisions made in the next 30 to 90 days about how to respond, how to restructure, and how to communicate the path forward will shape American bomber capability for the next generation. In the next 24 to 72 hours, watch for the Air Force's official statement from the Accident Investigation Board convening authority. Watch for congressional requests for briefings from the Secretary of the Air Force and the Chief of Staff. Watch for any signals from the program office at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where the formal B-52J Program Management Authority is located, about how it intends to characterize the impact on program milestones. And watch for whether the Air Force chooses to name a replacement testbed aircraft publicly, which would signal confidence, or remain silent on that question, which would signal that the internal debate about the recovery path has not yet been resolved. 8 people died at Edwards Air Force Base. The aircraft they were flying cannot be replaced tomorrow. The program it was supporting cannot simply pause and resume without consequence. And the strategic environment in which this crash occurred does not offer the luxury of extended recovery timelines without cost. This is not a story that ends at the crash site. It is a story that is just beginning, and how it ends will be determined by decisions that are being made right now, in offices and conference rooms that the public cannot see, by people carrying the weight of a loss that the public is only beginning to understand. Drop a comment below and tell me, where are you watching from, and what do you think the Air Force should prioritize in the next 90 days? Should they fast-track a replacement test bed at whatever cost? Should they pause and reassess the entire B-52J program structure? Should Congress be holding emergency hearings before the investigation is even complete? Tell me what you think. This conversation matters. And if you want to follow this investigation as the findings come in, as the congressional testimony develops, and as the Air Force makes the decisions that will define American bomber capability through the 2050s, subscribe now and hit the bell. This story is going to take months to fully unfold. I am not going anywhere.